a flavour now by the sounds of things. Well, tonight's speaker, Dr. Gary Eisenhauer, is a bird group member, but a bird group member with a bit of a difference. For a start, a very formative part of his childhood was in Orkney, on 2 remote islands. That sounds quite idyllic. I'm sure it wasn't at times, but it didn't stop him becoming a YOC member. Indeed, it encouraged him to do so, and his early interest in bird watching flourished there. Indeed, his early interest in the environment generally. And I imagine it was with rather a heavy heart that he and his family left Orkney, and he continued his school days in Northampton, and then perhaps surprisingly went on to study accountancy. That in a way, thankfully, didn't last too long, because he adopted a much more interesting career in geology and geography. He took a degree in those two subjects at Cheltenham and Gloucester College of Higher Education, with a particular interest right from the word go in paleontology. And that led to an MSc in micropaleontology at University College London, and then a PhD at Kingston University, where he studied ostracods. And I guess those are some of the unsung heroes of the living world. David Attenborough goes on about them, and why shouldn't he? Because they're the basis of so many food chains, and they have such a long fossil history. And I suspect Gary's interest in that gave him a unique insight into the way not only animal life, but wildlife environments have changed in the last 500 million years. And that sort of perspective is something that not many of us have the luxury of, or indeed are prepared to talk about, as we're going to hear this evening. It has a practical application, which Gary was able to exploit in terms of oil and gas exploration, because these little beasties can help date and identify the environments that might have been suitable for gas and oil formation in the past. And that brought him to North Wales as a consultant geologist, looking at oil and gas reserves in the North Sea and in the Middle East. And when he's not working, Gary is an overall wildlife enthusiast and keen Wildlife Trust volunteer, and a good photographer. And when he's not doing all of those things, he's looking for fossils. And indeed, that's the subject of his talk tonight. It's the paleontology of birds, fossil birds, and other interesting fossil creatures. Well, thank you very much, Gary, for giving us your time this evening. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. I shall just try to share screens again. Please tell me you can see the slide.
Yeah.
Good. Right. Well, yeah, well, thank you, Nigel, for that introduction, and hello, everyone, and thanks for attending. Yeah, and apologies for my somewhat tongue-in-cheek title to this talk, but it is quite a rare bird. Yeah, first thing I should say, though, is that I'm not a vertebrate paleontologist. I'm not an expert in fossil birds, and I can only, as Nigel said, profess to having been employed as a micropaleontologist looking at ostracods and foraminifera, which are somewhat different. So this talk is really, it's not, it does involve birds and paleontology, but it is more an account of my pilgrimage to what I consider as my fossil mecca, the place I'd come across Archaeopteryx back in undergraduate days in 1990. And it's somewhere I just wanted to go since then. And finally, 4 years ago, I got my chance to explore and visit the site of, well, what is one of the world's most famous fossils, and try looking for some. So birds were rare at that time, and they will be quite rare in this talk, but I promise you I have got some. So yeah, so this trip was, well, it's actually a holiday, really. It was a field excursion organised through the Geologists Association back in July 2016, and we had our leader, Dr. Dave Martell, who is a vertebrate paleontologist and expert on the subject. So as I'm sure a lot of you who go on birding holidays know, I'm just going to move something on the screen out of the way. Won't be a second. There you go. For those of you that go on birding holidays, you need to take kit with you. You need to have your scope, your binoculars, your camera. Well, if you're going on a geology trip, you need to take kit as well, slightly different kit. You need a high-vis jacket, hard hat, goggles in case you're hammering, hand lens, steel toe cap boots quite often, collecting bags, newspapers for wrapping specimens, cameras, scale bars. I mentioned a hard hat as well, so you can see some of my collection there in the top corner. And this was actually a coach trip. There were 17 of us, plus our leader Dave and the coach driver. And the slide's not advanced. I don't know what's going on. Right, okay. So yeah, so it was it was a coach trip we took from, we all met in London, across the Channel, into northern France, across Belgium, into Germany, and then heading down. And we headed down, for those of you who know this part of Germany, we're into Bavaria. There's 3 main areas where we're going to visit in this talk. The area south of Stuttgart, an area between Munich and Nuremberg, and then up near just south of Frankfurt. But the first thing we came across actually within a Belgian motorway service station was this awesome truck, which actually is tenuously paleontological. You can see up there, you've got your woolly mammoths and your saber-toothed tigers, but I just have to show it because it's just an awesomely decorated truck. And even to the attention of a stone tablet, which I'm sure quite a lot of us have been using tablets in the last couple of months being stuck at home. But the back of the truck even has a timeline with the history of humankind moving out of Africa. And as a result, this truck actually has the name, the Cradle of Humanity. And it's owned by a German freight and logistics company, Joseph Schumacher. And with a bit of digging, I found out they have quite a few trucks. They've got one called the Gold Rush, the Crusades, Charlemagne, the Constellations, the Mega Truck, the Emotion Truck, and of course, the dinosaurs. More of those later. Now, I've not seen the dinosaur truck, so I had to get these photos off the internet, but well, what can you say? Just awesomely decorated truck. But there are pterodactyls on the side here. There's a couple there, and Julian showed us last week the trackway or the trace fossil of a pterodactyl taking off. I can't show you any pterodactyl trackways, but I will be showing some other different kinds of trackways and trace fossils. So just a quick geological lesson, well, not really a lesson, but an introduction for those of you who might not be familiar. So if we look at the top band, this is essentially the history of the Earth. It began 4.6 billion years ago. The larger part of it is called the Precambrian. And then we'll be looking at fossils in this small section over here, the Phanerozoic. But there was a little bit of life in the Precambrian, first microfossils around 3.5 billion years ago, and the first signs of complex life coming in about 600 million years ago. But if we'll concentrate on this little section up here, and we'll expand that into the timeline that we're interested in. So across the top, I've just marked the main major extinctions that have taken place. Probably one of the largest ones was the end Permian, when 96% of marine species and 70% of land species died. Probably most people will be aware of the end Cretaceous one with the big meteorite that killed the dinosaurs, or did it? And I won't go into the modern day, but there's obviously talk there. And across the bottom, I've just put in a few firsts, a few sort of things, but I won't go through all of them. But I've highlighted the ones that fly. It's bird group after all. So we've got the first flying insects in the Devonian around 400 or so million years ago. The first pterosaurs or pterodactyls in the Triassic around 225 million years ago. Those are the earliest known vertebrates with a powered flight. The first birds towards the end of the Jurassic. And the first bats around, I think that's around 40, 45, 50 million years ago. So, as I said, I'm not a vertebrate paleontologist, so I won't go into a lot of detail on bird evolution, but this diagram on the right is just illustrating the actual relationship of birds and dinosaurs. And as you can see in the lineages here, so we've got Tyrannosaurus rex, or the Tyrannosaurids, up there, and they are an early lineage of Archaeopteryx. So the first birds are effectively dinosaurs. Birds today are effectively dinosaurs. They're just another type of theropod. But they didn't go extinct. We look at them every day. Now, this is just another diagram showing a similar sort of thing. You've got your Tyrannosaurids, you've got your Archaeopteryx, which we'll be looking at later, but in between, you can see you've got the evolution of varied feathers, wings, and then later on in the Cretaceous, the keeled sternums, the more truer features of birds. And then the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous, and you can see a lot of lineages got wiped out. And a lot of the birds that actually began to diversify in the Cretaceous, they also became extinct, but some made it through. And those that made it through, there's some lineages that are still around today, the ostriches and the like. But you can see after the asteroid impact, which was around here in 66 million years ago, birds got their chance to diversify. With the terrestrial land-based dinosaurs becoming extinct, birds and mammals took their chance. So the kinds of rocks we're going to be looking at in this talk are very special rocks. They're known as Lagerstätten, which is, the definition is a sedimentary deposit exhibiting extraordinary fossils with exceptional preservation, sometimes including preserved soft parts. And that's a term I'll be using with all of the rocks that we'll be looking at. It's actually a German term, and it means translates from the words Lager and Start, meaning storage place or place of storage. And yeah, it's where fossils are stored pretty well. So there are actually a huge long list of Lagerstätten across the world, and some of them, maybe the more famous ones that you might have heard of, are the Ediacaran fauna in southern Australia and the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada. That's probably one of the most famous. We have some in the UK. We've got the Wenlock series in Hertfordshire. There's the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, the London Clay in England, and there's some work going on a Welsh one going on at the moment, but can't say no more about that at the moment. But in Germany, they have got 4 Lagerstätten. We won't be looking at the Hunsrücker slates. I didn't get to go there purely because the coach they sent was too big to get up the road, so we had to ditch that part of the trip. But we'll be looking at the Posidonia Shale, which was south of Stuttgart, the Solnhofen Limestone, which is as I said, my trip to fossil Mecca, and the Messel Oil Shale, which is exceptional as well. So, Posidonia Shale. I made this talk for a geology presentation, so I won't go through all of the details, but I'm afraid I've left the slides in. So we're in the Jurassic. We've gone, early Jurassic, around 183 million years ago, which is roughly where the red arrow is. And it crops out across southern Germany in a sort of northeast, southwest sort of band. And it's an exceptionally well-preserved, a rock that contains exceptionally well-preserved, detailed skeletons of marine fish, reptiles, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodiles, ammonites. Most of the things you've probably heard about from the Dorset coast at Lyme Regis, and it is actually the same rock. It's the same age rock there. So yeah, it's a finely laminated bituminous mud or shale, and it's thought to be, well, it's debatable, but people are sort of thinking it's a deep marine environment. But either way, it's anoxic and it's oxygen depleted, and that's important because that helps preserve the fossils when they sink to the bottom, and it means bacteria is not as efficient, and there's also no organisms to scavenge, no burrowers to sort of disturb the fossils. And this is just a sort of little image to sort of give you an idea of what the environment was back 183 million years ago. We're looking at sort of a shallow sea with these sort of intermittent islands. And you can see there's the Lyme Regis along here, and it's connected. So that hence you're going to see the same organisms swimming across. If you're going to go looking for fossils, obviously you can go to cliff faces and quarries, but to cliff faces and coastlines, but there's not too many of them in this part of Germany. So it's quarries that are the best place to actually go finding fossils. And some of the best places are actually working quarries, and therefore it's very important to actually visit the owners of the quarries out of courtesy. And in this particular case, this is the Dottenhausen Cement Works. And in their reception, they have a little diagram explaining how the company works. They mine limestone from the top of the hill. That comes down to the factory via gravity, a gravity cable car. They strip mine the mudstones and the shales, and these are taken by conveyor belt up to the cement works. And in the process, they actually generate their own electricity. They give that back to the grid. Their factory also has, well, they give a lot back to the local community. Obviously, a lot of the local community work in this factory, but inside this main reception area here, they have a concert hall, lecture theatre, they hold scientific meetings, they have an art exhibition, they have school parties, they have their own museum and their own paleontologist. And here's just a few images from their actual own museum. So we've got ammonites here, which I'm sure some of you have seen, and something called a crinoid, but I'll go into a little bit more detail on crinoids in a short while. Yeah, so they have a big display of ammonites in this museum, and that's because ammonites, as some of you probably know, are one of the most common, most recognizable fossils. And many of these species in these images in this museum are exactly the same ones that you can find on the south coast of England or even around Cheltenham. I mean, I've collected Oxynotus eris oxynotum, sorry, from a landfill site near Cheltenham, and yeah, you find the same species. So for those of you who've not seen ammonites, make a mental picture of these, because I'll be showing you something else later that relates back to these. Other things they've got in their own museum are ichthyosaurs and fish. And outside, they have a children's fossil area. Obviously, some rather large children, slightly older, bigger children here. But this is purposely designed as a safe area for kids and the school parties to come and actually look for fossils. And it's not hard to find any. Here's two that were just lying right in a slab at the front there. But not for us. Oh, sorry, I forgot. So if you're going to go looking for fossils, obviously it's good to get an impression or an idea of what you might find before you go there, because what you find never quite looks like a museum specimen. All these museum specimens have an awful lot of preparation goes into them, but it's still a good place to get your eye in first. And this museum here is a family-run museum, and it is actually dedicated to the fossils of one particular rock, and that is the rock in this area. And you can see just by some of the images I took outside the museum how much the local community really buys into the importance of what they've got on their doorstep. So you've got flat numbers indicated by ammonites. You've got weather veins, that's an ichthyosaur, and these are just some images from outside the museum. This is another ammonite depicting what the soft body looked like, except for the fact that that's just surmise, because to this date, the soft parts of an ammonite have never been found, not even in these supposedly, not even in these exceptional rocks that we're about to look at. And like all good museums, there's a illustration of how you find the fossils. So this is like a depiction of sort of lifting up the slabs in the field, preparation in the labs back under a microscope as the delicate work of cleaning up the fossils. And yeah, more ammonites. Here's our Oxynotus eris again. I mentioned exceptional preservation. Now, those of you who have been to Lyme Regis or even the Yorkshire coast may well have found these sort of objects here. These are belemnites. This is the calcitic guard of a belemnite. And you can pick these up on the beach at Lyme Regis pretty easily. But what you don't find very often are the tentacles preserved. And you can see here, this is it's a squid-like organism. It's not around today. It became extinct at the end of the Cretaceous with the big asteroid impact, as did the ammonites as well. There's an ammonite just in the bottom here. But yes, what makes this area so important is you're getting preservation of things you don't normally see, the soft parts, the tentacles. You also get the ink sacs preserved on occasion as well. And crustacea. Now, this isn't that much difference to what you might see in the seas today. And fish, exceptionally preserved fish, all the details of the bones and the skin, not the skin, sorry, there's no skin in that one, but the bones and the fins. Crocodiles. And this crocodile is curled round on itself. You can see its snout going underneath its vertebrae. Plesiosaurs, similar to the ones that are found in Lyme Regis. And if you go to the Natural History Museum, you can see these, or the Dorset Museum. Ichthyosaurs, again. But again, this one is quite an exceptional one. You can see that a very small ichthyosaur here. This was well, they reckon this was an embryo that was extruded from the body during death. And I don't know if you can see here, I'll just enlarge this section here. You can see rows of vertebrae, and those are actually, well, it was pregnant, this ichthyosaur, when it died. So those are juveniles within. But despite being exceptional vertebrate fossils, one of the most amazing fossils actually, well, say fossils, there's 300 individuals in this particular image, is this thing. It's actually a log. This dark band in the middle is an 18-meter long log, and attached to it are over 300 crinoids. Now, crinoids are related to your sea urchins that you can find today, or starfish, sea urchins, brittle stars, sea cucumbers. They're all part of the same phylum, same group. And crinoids are still around today. There's around 625 species still around today, and they are suspension feeders, and they capture particles from surrounding waters with their tube feet on their arms. And in this case, 300 of them have actually attached themselves to this log, and they would have been floating in the Jurassic Ocean. And I actually found out today that there's a paper been written about floating logs and crinoids in the Jurassic, and they reckon that this particular example could have floated. Well, you can see that the crinoids are quite long. They've got quite long sort of attachments to this log, and it's quite likely that this log was floating for maybe 10 or even 20 years to create this growth. Now, this is a quick video. I'll just let it play.
Posidonia Shale. There are just a few
So this is just an image, a reconstruction of what it might have looked like back in Jurassic times. So you can see here the log with the crinoids attached and just catching food as they go, and then we've got some fish and an ammonite and an ichthyosaur. But it's not just about the fossils that I've shown you. Now, there weren't any birds at this time in the Jurassic. They hadn't yet evolved, but there were flying organisms, flying reptiles. And this is the pterodactyl, or a pterosaur, or a pterodactyl. And the meaning of it is simply, pterosaur is winged lizard. And these are your first vertebrates with powered flight. As I said, this part of Germany really buys into the fact that fossils and the importance of them, and you can see here you can buy books on how to prepare fossils, and this is a magazine for the hobby paleontologist. Unfortunately, they didn't have them in English, and I couldn't speak German. So where do you go to find fossils? Well, we go to the quarry. This is the strip mining that I mentioned that the factory does. And during the lunch break, when they down tours, they let us at the actual working face. We didn't find any vertebrates. Well, we found a piece of vertebrate here, and you can tell this actually belongs to a marine organism because it's concave on both sides. Land animals like ourselves, we have vertebrae that are concave convex, but the marine organisms, they don't need to have that kind of support because they've got water, so they have concave vertebrae. The only sort of things we found, though, while on our time there, was ammonites and nautiloids and some bivalves. We didn't have a lot of time there. That's the difficult thing. To find the stuff, you really need to put in the hours, and unfortunately, we didn't have the time. But that's not the most important place I wanted to go to. So the Solnhofen Limestone, this is the one that mattered to me. This is my fossil mecca. So we've jumped forward about 40 million years. We're right at the end of the Jurassic now. So this is the real Jurassic Park, not that film, but the Solnhofen Limestone. This is a real Jurassic Park. So we're looking at the Devonian late Jurassic, 145 million years ago. We're in Bavaria, as I said from the map earlier. And this is a very fine limestone, and it preserves very rare assemblages, such as there's soft-bodied imprints of things like sea jellies or jellyfish, sea jellies. And there's actually been over 600 species of fossil actually identified from this rock, including 29 different kinds of pterosaurs, some the size of a sparrow, some over a meter long. And it's actually the Solnhofen Limestone and the overlying Mornsheim formation are actually where pterosaurs were first described back in 1784, and then first named, as I said, as flying reptiles in 1801. And there's been a few thousand specimens collected since then. But it's also known more for Archaeopteryx, which is, I'll show you it in a minute. It's one of the most famous fossils, I'm sure, in the world. Quick bit of geology. So we're looking at an archipelago at the edge of an ocean. We've got lagoons with limited access to the sea. Salinity was high, resulting in a kind of brine that couldn't support a lot of life. And the lower water levels were devoid of oxygen. So again, we didn't have any scavengers, any burrowers. So fossils that actually reached the sea floor had a good chance to be preserved complete. And so any organisms that fell, drifted or washed in were then buried in a very soft carbonate mud. And it allowed the delicate features to be preserved without any scavengers, without any currents to sort of tear them apart. And as a result, you get things like the wings of dragonflies, the imprints of feathers, plants. Sometimes the lagoon dried out and organisms would crawl into the sticky muds and become trapped. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute shortly. Yeah, so this is a very fine-grained limestone. It's been quarried for 200–300 years. And it's used for roof tiles, flagstones, flooring stones, but also for lithographic plates. And that's due to its fact it's extremely fine-grained. It's got a very even porosity, and it absorbs ink. And you can see an example here. And as a result, it was extensively quarried. And it's during this quarrying that it revealed the fossils that are found. Now, I'm going to show you some exceptional fossils, and there's been thousands of fossils found, but it's not actually a very fossiliferous rock. It's just the fact that it's been looked at for so many years, well, hundreds of years, by so many people, that it's resulted in so many fossils. But it's most famous for Archaeopteryx, the first bird, or potentially the first bird. And it's been named Archaeopteryx, which is Greek for ancient wing or feather. And the species name lithographica comes from the fact that the actual rock was used for lithographic plates. And this is what everybody got excited about. Neither of these are original. These are both casts. This is a cast of the London specimen, which was the first one found in 1861. And some of you may have seen it in the Natural History Museum in London. And I think is there not a a copy actually in the natural history, in the museum in Bangor, isn't there? Up above where we used to have the bird group talks, I think.
There is indeed, Gary, yes.
So, phew. But this is the very first one that was ever found in 1861. You can see the imprint of the feathers, but it's not complete. It's missing a head, it's missing some claws, it's missing one of its skull. But the importance of it is it was the first one, and it was probably found by a quarryman. Well, it would have been found by a quarryman, but it came into the hands of a local physician by the name of Carl Haberlein. And he probably took it in return for medical fees, because a lot of the quarrymen weren't paid a lot of money or high wages, and they paid for their medical fees with the fossils that they found. And Carl Haberlein was a keen paleontologist. He liked to collect fossils, he liked to curate them and preserve them. But when he came across this one, he knew he was going to be able to make some money. Now, he eventually sold it to the Natural History Museum in London for £700, which in today's money is around £83,000. It wasn't quite as straightforward as that. He offered it to other museums who couldn't afford it. He offered it to the Natural History Museum, who weren't prepared to pay £700. In fact, the trustees had set a ceiling of £500, but the then I've forgotten my director, Richard Owen, was so desperate to have this fossil that he went above their heads and paid £700 for it, plus all the other fossils that Dr. Haberlein had at the time as well as part of the deal. And he agreed to pay for it over 2 installments. He was also crafty that he actually got somebody else to actually to pay for it, so that when the trustees then found out that they paid over the odds, he didn't get the blame. He was a bit crafty. But anyway, and there's a lot more to the ins and outs of that. On the right hand side is the Berlin specimen now. I should say most of the Archaeopteryx specimens are actually named after the institution and where they're now housed. Hence the London specimen is in London, the Berlin specimen is at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. Now, the Berlin specimen, you can see, well, I think is a slightly better, well, a much better specimen. It's more complete. You can see the skull, it's got the neck, it's got all the limbs, all the claws. It's a more complete specimen. In fact, it's the most complete specimen found to date. Now, it was found in, well, 1874, 1875 by another quarry worker who sold it to a chap called Ernst Otto Haberlein, who turned out to be the son of Dr. Haberlein, who bought the first one. And Ernst Haberlein, the son, initially bought it thinking it was a pterodactyl for 2,000 marks, which is around 3,750 quid, but 3,750 pound in today's terms. And he started work on it. He started sort of chipping away and uncovering it. And that's when because the feathers weren't actually in view when he bought it. And he soon realized he had the second Archaeopteryx. And he soon realized the importance of it. And he tried to sell it for 25,000 marks. So that's an upgrade from 2,000 to 25,000. He was trying to sell it in modern day terms for £47,000. And he couldn't get a buyer because people considered it overpriced, even though it was half the price that Richard Owen had actually paid 13 years before. And he actually upped his price to 36,000 marks, but even though he couldn't sell it at the lower mark. And after 4 years, he eventually did manage to sell it to the Berlin Museum for 20,000 marks, which is around £37,500. Still pretty good by all accounts. And it was financed by Ernst Werner von Siemens. And you might recognize the name Siemens from the electronics firm. And I think they have a factory in Llanberis as well. But it was the founder of that firm that actually financed keeping this specimen in Germany. Germany was kind of upset that they'd lost the first specimen to London. But, well, I think they got the better deal in the long run. They've certainly got the nicer specimen. Now, there's a whole lot that goes into the Victorian shenanigans of trying to sell this specimen to different institutions. There's skullduggery, there's accusations of forgery and that it wasn't. And to be honest, a whole book could be written on it. And a whole book was written on it by a friend of mine, Paul Chambers. It's an interesting read. It's not so much about paleontology, but it's a really good account of the actual debating and to and fro and, well, everything that goes into it back in Victorian days. So, Solenhofen Limestone. Now you know you've got flying birds. We've got a quick depiction of what the environment was like. So again, shallow seas with these large islands. I won't read that because it didn't photograph very well, but this sums up the environment. So the theropod dinosaurs originate from the islands. That's the land dinosaurs. They originate from islands that formed a framework around these lagoons, with heavily vegetated low-lying islands with conifers, seed ferns, which grew in mangrove-like fashion. The Archaeopteryx, despite the fact it was thought to have limited flight ability, has a much greater spread, and it extends from the islands close to the sea to the low-lying islands around the lagoons. So it was obviously much more mobile than the feathered but flightless dinosaurs. And hopefully that gives you a picture of what the environment was like, sort of lagoons and mangroves. And this is just another box image. So you've got your islands, you've got your lagoons, you've got your reefs. Again, it's really good to go to a museum to get your eye in. And there's a couple of really great museums in this part of the Solnhofen specimens. There's the Jura Museum. This impressive building used to be a monastery. And the fossil collection actually began when the monks used to buy the fossils from the local quarrymen for teaching purposes. And they're proud to have their own Archaeopteryx. This is the Eichstätt specimen because it's in the Eichstätt Museum. It's got a skull, it's got a neck, but the feathers aren't really depicted in this particular specimen, but it's pretty quite complete. And what you're looking at here is the two halves. So you've got the counterpart here when the rock split. So you can see the two halves. One half has the actual bones, one half has the impression. And this museum also has a comprehensive collection of actual, not original specimens, but copies. So it's got the feather. Now the feather was actually came before the London specimen. It was the very first thing. This is what the actual Archaeopteryx lithographica was actually named from the feather originally. It was only a year later they actually got the skeleton. It also has the third skeleton found by 1956. You can still see the impression of the feathers there. That's the Maxberg specimen. It's now lost or presumed lost or stolen. They've also got a copy of one from the Munich specimen, which may be a different species because it is actually much smaller. But you can see here the seventh one was actually found as recently as 1992. And then they've also got a cast of the Haarlem specimen, which the astute amongst you might notice is dated 1855. So how come that's not the first specimen? Well, it's because it was originally thought of to be the limbs of a pterodactyl. And it was only 100 years later that it was reanalyzed and thought, oh no, this is Archaeopteryx. And I actually read today that actually they now think it's not Archaeopteryx, but something else again. So there's still debate going on. But this is what the Jura Museum thinks it might look like. Now, if you were, excuse me, if you were bird watching in the Jurassic, you probably wouldn't look at that and think, that's a bird I'm looking at. You'd probably look at it and think, that's a feathered dinosaur. And essentially, that's what they actually are, feathered dinosaurs. But they are beginning to show the first bird-like traits. Hence, they're thought to be the first birds. But it's not just about Archaeopteryx. We've got pterosaurs, again, or pterodactyls. And we've got a couple here, the long-tailed pterodactyl and the short-tailed pterodactyl. And this one here, you've got the actual preservation of the wing membranes as well. And there's a couple of non-avian theropod dinosaurs. And the exceptional preservation and also the exceptional work of the curators to actually prepare them as well is just painstakingly slow, but also the attention to detail. Other things you can find in these rocks, you've got small lizard-like creatures, turtles, even three-dimensional turtles. You can see it hasn't been compressed to this one. Crustacea, that's, even the fin antennae, pretty much similar to what you might find today. And the thing about the rocks here, they don't just preserve the fossil they produce, they also record the tracks. So this is actually a shrimp. This is the trail of that shrimp. Remember I mentioned the briny, when the sea level dropped and became a sort of briny substance, sticky mud. Well, this one was crawling through that sticky mud and then demised. Same again here, you can see this one, it crawled, and that was it. But there's other things, there's plants, there's insects, there's a sort of locust looking thing up at the top here, you've got plants, fish, or the guitar fish. Coelacanth, this is actually known as the living fossil because it was thought to be long extinct until somebody found one in a fish market in Southeast Asia, I think about 30 or 40 years ago. And it turns out it's still alive. Well, not exactly the same species, but it's still alive in the Indian Ocean today. And this is Coelacanth, the living fossil. Now, I mentioned ammonites, those coiled shells. Well, this is the trace of a rolling ammonite. So as it rolled, it left a mark, and then another mark, and another mark, and another mark. This is a fish, trackway of a fish. And this is a fossil that actually tells a story. So you might recognize that that's the tail of a fish, and it's not that clear, but that's the head of the fish. And then around the outside, these are like fish tail marks. You can see these little curved structures here. They match the shape of the tail as it was going around. And this is actually a fish death trail. It's the concentric tail marks of while it was alive and flapping. It disrupted the algal mat that was there at the time. Then the gases in the body, in the thorax, would have built up as it decayed. The stomach exploded, and this is what you're looking at here. These are the the bones of the stomach that have been shattered and exploded outwards, and then the algal mat grew over the top again, preserving the fish and its actual trace fossils. But some of the fish are exceptionally well preserved, even complete with pigment, similar to fish of modern day, which have a darker upper surface and a paler, lighter surface. This one reminds me of a trout or a salmon. And the other museum that's worth a visit is the Solnhofen Museum, because they actually boast 3 Archaeopteryx specimens, not copies, but 3 originals. They actually have the largest specimen known at present, which may actually be a different genera and species. But as this image down here in the bottom right shows, it's not complete. It's actually, although I thought that was the head, it's actually missing its head. It's missing most of its neck, and it's also not preserved the feathers. Now this is the Solnhofen, and it's the 6th one found as recently as 1970. They also have in their possession the one known as the Burgermeister Muller specimen, or chicken wing, because it is literally just a wing. It's probably one of the most complete wings, with all the bones still actually connected. And actually, but although you can't see it in these images, we've got the counterpart on the right as well. Although you can't see it in the image, it actually preserves the claw as well. But the claw is embedded in the sediment, and they've managed to use synchrotron X-ray tomography to actually visualize the claw within the sediment. And X-ray tomography is a good way to actually non-destructively image a fossil without actually having to break the rock apart. And it's used quite often to image the inside of fossil skulls, dinosaur skulls, to get the shape of the brain case. And you see this is the 9th specimen found literally 20 years ago. They also have the 11th and today undernamed specimen. Again, this one is actually missing its skull, missing its head again, but it's got some pretty good, well-preserved claws and feathers. And this one, the 11th, just 9 years ago. They've got pterodactyls there as well, and a small juvenile feathered predatory dinosaur. And this is just a close-up of that. And these are actually rarer than Archaeopteryx, probably because Archaeopteryx could fly across from parts of the sea, from island to island perhaps, and therefore had more chance of greater spread and landing in, whereas these feathered land dinosaurs were stuck on these small islands. But as I said, this also preserves the really soft parts of organisms. So here we've got jellyfish, free jellyfish. You know, the chances of that being preserved. And squids, horseshoe crabs, and you can see the actual trail of the horseshoe crab again in this image here. And if I just larger, this is the same horseshoe crab. You can see the length of trail that has actually been left by it. And again, these are still around today, the horseshoe crabs. More crustacea, again, exceptional preservation. Another way you can illustrate the detail is using ultraviolet light and a thin section, as in these two examples. Fish, starfish, more fish, dogfish, just again, some exceptional preservation. Sea urchins, I'm sure you recognize these, but here we've got the spines preserved, and over on the right hand side, the undigested remains of a sea urchin, the intestines in the gut. More ammonites, we've seen them before. Insects, dragonflies, beetles, and then wings. Again, you're not actually getting the original thing here, you're just getting a preservation of the imprint of the wing due to the fine-grained sediment that was there. Leaves and plants that came into the water. So, where do you find these actual immaculate fossils? Well, quarries again. Now this is the Langenalterheim quarry, and this is actually where the very first Archaeopteryx was found. The one that in the Natural History Museum, the one that was found in 1861, was found right here on the right hand side. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but literally behind this green bush, underneath a house and a factory building. It's obviously the site of one of the most famous fossils ever found, and there's no plaque, there's nothing special. You can't go there, it's a working quarry. You can just stand by the side of the road and look across, well, from the car park. So it's literally, if you look at the image on the left, it's just down here by this white roofed building. You'd think there'd be a blue plaque equivalent, wouldn't you? But not so. But as I said, it's still a working quarry today. It's quite extensive, and the quarrymen work under these little huts to protect them from the sun, and they're producing these stacked up split pieces of rock for, as I said, for roofing tiles, flooring stones, and the like. But they will also find fossils while they're doing it, and I'm sure they put them to one side and make a little bit of money on the side if the quarry owner doesn't get there first. But if you're in this part of Germany, one of the best places to go if you want to go fossil hunting is to Mornsheim. It's actually a commercial enterprise. This chap here, Roland Bosch, has bought himself a small quarry. He set up a business. I can't remember how much you pay, but it's not a huge amount, and you can stay there all day if you want. He provides everything. He'll lend you a hammer, he'll lend you chisels, he'll lend you eye protection, he provides newspapers and boxes for you to wrap your fossils up. He'll sell you drinks, including beer, which on the day we were there, it ranged from rain through to really hot, so you can get beer and just take it down to your little site where you're excavating. It's got a picnic area, and he'll arrange for lunch to come up from the nearby village. It's just an awesome place, an awesome little enterprise. And he is known as Mr. Pterodactyl because he has found, I think, more pterodactyls than any other person in Germany. And I actually also found out today that he might have found the 13th Archaeopteryx, or it's not Archaeopteryx, but a fossil bird from the same age. If you don't find any fossils there, you will, but if you don't, will sell you some of the ones he's found at very reasonable prices, and certainly better prices than the fossil shops down in the town. There's actually a scientific dig going on, so we weren't allowed into that area. Maybe that's where he was excavating the bird I was reading about earlier that was found the year after we visited. So there you go. But essentially, you have free range of this area. You clear yourself of the loose material off the top, which has probably already been searched for. Dig yourself a little pit, and you're looking at virgin new rock that has never been seen by anybody before. I could have spent days there. In fact, I could probably spend a week's holiday there. Unfortunately, we only got a couple of hours. He's got some information boards as well, which would have been helpful if I'd actually read them first, instead of just taking a photo. But here you go. So what did we find? Well, I found myself some ammonites. So the ammonites are pretty common, but previous finds at the site, as I mentioned, have been pterodactyls, ammonites, fish, shrimps, vertebrates. Our group found ammonites. Aptiki is actually the plate that goes over the entrance of an ammonite. It's sort of when it retreats inside its shell, it pulls a sort of the doorway shut. We found some fish fragments, and we found coprolites, fossil poo. That's quite common. Another quarry that's also worth a visit when you're there is this one, the Schoenfeld Sportsplatz quarry, which is literally behind a football ground. And you can see the rock it's still very horizontal, it's very platy, it's easy to split, and this is our group busy seeing what they could find. And although not birds, one of the fossils that's quite common there is this thing called a free-swimming crinoid. I showed you the crinoids attached to the log. Well, this is one that actually doesn't attach itself, it actually free swims around, and they're quite common. In fact, this piece here, which is, I don't know, maybe maybe about 10, 15 centimeters across, and I've got 7 specimens in it. Yeah, so I've actually got scale in this one, which is something I should have put as a geologist in most of my other photos, and I apologize for that. And another thing you get at this quarry, it's not actually a fossil, it's called dendrites. It's actually the intricate pattern of iron and manganese. And quite a lot of people, artists, collect these, and they actually incorporate them into drawings on the actual rock face. Remember I said this is a lithographic limestone, it absorbs ink really well, and it's good for printing. Well, I've seen pictures where these have been incorporated into a landscape image, and this is maybe a piece of vegetation or a tree. It's very common there. What sort of things have been found? More pterodactyls, shrimps, fish, another of our living coelacanth, the living fish, fossil fish. And what did we find? We had more ammonites, more coprolites, a complete small fish, which I'll come back to later. Somebody found a fish trail, and our group, even though we weren't there for very long, one guy uncovered a pretty rare shrimp. So that's the Solnhofen Limestone. And the last place we got to visit was the Messel Pit. This is much younger. We've jumped forward about 100 million years now. So we're up into the Paleogene. We're the other side of the Cretaceous extinction, the big asteroid here. And we're at a slightly different place, different kinds of fossils. Again, abundant. This is geologically and scientifically important. It's a disused shale mine, and it nearly became a landfill site, but thankfully it was stopped by strong local resistance. And it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1995. Any fossils you find there, stay there. It's a no-take zone. You're just not allowed to take them home. And yeah, this is just a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So a quick background. They've mined oil shale there since 1859. Fossils first became sort of known about only around 1900, but it wasn't until the 1970s when serious scientific excavation began. That was around when the commercial oil shale mining ceased. The cement factory then failed. Amateur collectors went in on the site, developed a special technique for preserving these fossils, and I'll explain why in a moment. As I said, it nearly became a landfill site, but fortunately was bought by the local state and secured. And in 1996, they had an amnesty on the previous collected fossil sites in the hope that they would come out back from private collection into public ownership and then become available for science. And as I said, it's a World Heritage Site, and everything has to be handed back. So what kind of rock are we looking at? Well, as I said, we're 47 million years ago. We're about 10 degrees further south than we are today in Germany. It's much warmer. It was actually a very warm period of thermal maximum. It was an area of lakes surrounded by lush subtropical forests with an incredible diversity of life. And the actual Messel Lake, the pit, was actually probably the center point for drainage from a lot of rivers and streams, which is why it was almost like a central point for the fossils to accumulate. I hate to think of the terminology dustbin, but almost. And because it was oil shale, it was a very anoxic environment, very slow deposition, lots of dead vegetation, perfect for preservation, and also, again, anoxic, no scavengers, and very minor bacterial activity. And as a result, you get a remarkable clarity and preservation of fossils. So it wasn't all dead. The upper parts of the lake would have supported a variety of organisms, but the bottom of the lake was where the anoxic area with little disturbance. So it was a stratified lake, and that stratification would have gone up and down with seasons. The oxygen content might have risen and receded. And that would have caused periodic die-offs of the stuff living in the upper levels. And as I said, a low rate of deposition and preservation of flora and fauna. But another important factor was it was a very volcanic area as well at this time, very tectonically active, and they reckon that the actual lake was a maar lake or a volcanic lake, and there would be eruptions of CO2. And when they came up, those eruptions would, well, it's been hypothesized it was analogous to what happened in 1986 at Lake Nyos in Africa, Cameroon, I think, when a volcanic gas release rose up through the water body. Carbon dioxide is very heavy, it sinks, and I think it killed farm animals. I think, was it 1,700 people died? And a lot of the local farm animals and the wildlife all died. And it's been hypothesized the same thing was happening repeatedly at this time in the Eocene, 47 million years ago. So birds and any bats flying over would have been overcome by carbon dioxide, fallen into the lake. Terrestrial animals around the lake shore overcome by the carbon dioxide. And since the lake was very deep, the animals would drift down gently into the oxygen and bacteria poor water and become preserved. And it enabled exceptional quality, quantity, integrity, and variety, even to the level of fur, feathers, and skin shadows in some species. And where do you go to see them? The museum, of course, the Darmstadt Museum in Darmstadt. And here's a few examples. So we've got primitive insectivore-like mammals. This one is known as longfinger because it's got a long finger, and it probably used that to probe insects out of wood, a bit like, is it the IA in Madagascar? And we've got primitive mammals. We've got the first primitive tapir, primitive horses. They've actually found horses that are actually pregnant. I think there's I can't remember how many it is, but they've got a collection of pregnant primitive horses that they found. So maybe there's some seasonality and when the actual carbon dioxide was happening, or the stratification in the water body, and that the pregnant horses all died at that particular season. You've also got mice, primates, hedgehogs, marsupials, pangolins, aardvarks, rodents with a skin shadow. You can see the shadow of the skin preserved by bacteria. And that bacteria implantation can actually preserve the hairs, the feathers, the skin shadows, wing membranes, even the intestines contents. even the scale, scaling of insect colouring. Got the limbs of lemur, which they hypothesize is the fact that they were eaten by crocodiles or other animals, and that's why they've been broken. You've got frogs, salamanders, reptiles, amphibians, different kinds of crocodiles, freshwater crocodiles, double dogtooth, armor-plated ones, snakes. I think there's yeah, turtles. They've got turtles. They've actually found 9 turtles that are actually mating, which is as illustrated in this example here. This is a mating turtle, or a pair of mating turtles. They've also found tiny juveniles. And it's supposed that the turtles had started mating in the aerated surface waters. As they sank into the deeper water, they became overcome by one of these releases of toxic volcanic gas. Obviously, death was rapid, very rapid, and burial. And turtles belonging to this clade are still alive today, and their skin absorbs oxygen from the water, so that's not an advantage if you're in an area with high amounts of carbon dioxide or anoxic conditions. Fish. Fish are one of the most common things found in this lake. There's actually been over 10,000 fish actually found, of which those 8 different kinds of species. Sorry. Yeah, I should have said they've actually found over 132 different vertebrate species, 45 different species of mammal, 31 different species of reptile, and 5 different species of amphibians in these sediments. As I said, we've got plants, pollen, wood, walnuts, grapevines, thousands of aquatic and terrestrial insects. It's one of the most numerous, but some with distinct coloration. Unfortunately, I haven't got any photos of any of the insects. But bird group, got to have the flying organisms. So we've got bats. Lost my numbers for bats. Yeah, sorry, I've lost. Yeah, no. So we've got bats, and complete with the actual membrane. You can see the actual membrane and outline of the ears has actually been preserved by the fossil bacteria. It's a process known as bacterial mapping or bacterial imprintation. But birds. Now, I showed you this diagram before. Some of the birds made it through the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. But with the extinction of the actual land-based theropod dinosaurs, this was the chance for mammals and birds to diversify. And as you can see by this diagram here, birds diversified pretty rapidly within the first sort of 10 or so million years after the mass extinction. And the red line is indicating, this is 47 million years old, this is the age of the Messel Pit. So at this time, quite a lot of the bird lineages had actually established themselves by this point. And here's some of them. So we've got a hoopoe-like bird. I've got some scale this time, so there's a scale bar at the bottom. So this one's 2 centimeter scale bar. They've got relatives of the nightjar, swift-type possible ancestors of hummingbirds. Now there is actually an image I haven't got of they have actually found a swift that actually looks like a modern day swift. I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, but it has the same sickle-shaped wings, although they think it had a slightly different environmental ecological habit. But again, we've got the impressions of the feathers here. It's just incredible, isn't it? So these are 47 million years old. They've got crane-like birds, ibis-like birds, a thing called the Messel rail. And the Messel rail is actually the most common bird found there. 60% of all birds found are actually Messel rails. And they've also got these giant cursorial birds, Gastornis, or flightless birds. Now, this isn't a specimen from this site. To date, they've only actually found a femur, but they were probably about. More birds. I'm afraid I didn't manage to get an ID for these ones. wasn't on the ball when I was taking the photos, but again, you can see the feathers preserved and the quality of the skeleton and the beak. And this is actually the same bird in both photos. I've just developed it in slightly a different way because it shows the detail. So although the pictures I've shown you have all been complete specimens, most of the actual birds are actually disarticulated, well, not disarticulated, they're headless, or the head and the body has been separated, and that's due to them floating in the water and decaying, and the hollow bones and the airfield feathers would have floated for longer than the heavier skull became detached, and therefore they both sank down to the bottom separately, and it creates a sort of spatial and temporal depositional separation. Now, I did a little bit of work today. I actually found some extra information that I put into this talk. I found a summary from the World Heritage Datasheet of 2011, where apparently, as of 2011, they'd found 43 species of birds in 23 different families within the Messel sediments. Extremely good preservation, bacterial mapping showing single barbicles on feathers, barbels should I say on feathers, plus pigmentation also preserved. And the kind of birds that have actually been found, and I haven't got pictures for them all, I'm afraid, but at the top of the food chain was the giant flightless birds. There were proto-ostriches, the Messel rail, which you've just seen, which formed 60% of the bird fossils found. There were flamingo-like birds, a primitive falcon, owls, freshwater booby, crane-like birds, swift-like birds, early hummingbirds, hoopoe-like, we had the picture, and birds resembling parrots, woodpeckers, rollers, mousebirds, frogmouths. That was in 2011, and then this summary from a paper I found from 2017, he expresses the Messel as yielding a rich avian fossil characterized by a considerable number of flightless birds, a high diversity of aerial insectivores, and an absence of large arboreal birds. But now there are 70 currently known species in 42 genus and at least 39 family level taxa. So in the space of 6 years, they've added 23 species. That's how prolific the fossils are there. And what they have in distribution there is analogous to a modern day tropical biota in terms of species richness and taxonomic diversity. So, quick look at the Messel site and how you find fossils there. As it was a quarry, it's becoming overgrown and vegetated, but we're going to head down to this little area down here. And the way you collect fossils here is slightly different to the way we collected earlier in the trip. Remove the spoil off the top to expose the bedding. And then this very straight line is actually cut with a chainsaw. And then you get your wedges in and a hammer and you prise away these slabs as big as you can. Try not to break them up too much, obviously, because you don't know what's actually going to be hidden or concealed in the different layers. So you're trying to break these slabs away. And then they go to the next stage where somebody with a machete carefully actually splits the layers open. I should have shown before how quickly the rock dries out and how very thinly layered it is. But you can split these rocks, and these are some fish that we found during our couple of hours there. So we've got 3 fish there, and then down in the bottom left, this is more coprolites, which is important because that can be analysed under the microscope, and you can work out the organism, what produced it, and what its diet was. But as I mentioned, these fossils they had to develop a very special method to preserve these fossils. You could see in the photo before how quickly that rock dried out, because it contains 40% water. And it will dry out and disintegrate very quickly. So therefore, it's important that the fossils are put back into water as soon as possible and kept moist and then carefully cleared of the sediment. And you put like a rim of clay around it to stop it sort of breaking apart. And then you apply a layer of epoxy resin, let that set over the skeleton, turn it over, and then you clear all of the sediment and the oil shale away from the other side. And hopefully you've got a fossil left preserved in the actual epoxy resin, which was what those museum specimens, if you notice the orange background, that was the epoxy resin where the skeleton has actually been embedded into it. Right, we're nearly there, we're nearly finished, you'll be pleased to know. it's not just fossils, and we've got a few other things that are worth seeing in this part of Germany. Craters. Now, I didn't just put this in because Julian showed us a crater last week. I had already planned to include this bit. So this is a satellite image of an impact crater that you can still see today in Germany. It's around Miocene in age. It's roughly 4 kilometers in diameter. It's still exposed. And they've modeled that it was actually caused by something the size of 150 meters in diameter. And you can go there, and this is us standing on the southern rim of the crater, looking across to the northern crater. And you can actually go into this crater. People live in it. And not far to the, about a few, yeah, to the northwest. So this is the Steinheim crater that we've just visited down here. To the northeast is this one. This is the Nordlingen Rice impact crater. It's a very large circular depression in western Bavaria. It's Miocene in age, so we've jumped forward to roughly 14.5 million years now. So we're now much younger than all of the sites we've visited. And the poignancy of this is that if this meteorite had landed 30 kilometers to the west, to the east, sorry, Archaeopteryx would have been obliterated. So quite lucky, really. So yeah, this crater is 24 kilometers in diameter. They reckon that it was actually caused by an impactor that came in at 30 to 50 degrees in an east-northeast directed impact. It had, the actual impactor was at 1.5 kilometers in diameter, had a velocity of 45,000 miles per hour, and the exploding power of 1.8 million Hiroshima bombs. That's what they've extrapolated. And you can still see it today. And this is it. This is the view of the crater from the top of the church tower. And the tree line in the distance here is actually marking the rim of the crater. This is the medieval town of Nordlinge. This is where we stayed. So in this crater, unlike the one in Arizona, you can actually sleep in this crater. And as I said, when the crater, when the meteor hit, fortunately, it didn't hit the area slightly to the east where all those exceptional fossils are preserved. It hit a series of rocks that got thrown up in the air and came down and formed this other rock called Suvite. And Suvite is a sort of a mix of all the sedimentary rocks, the ironstones, the gneiss, the Triassic sandstones, but also it contains cosite, and that proves it was a meteorite because you can only find cosite either in a metamorphic rock or something that's been formed by a meteorite due to the intense heat and pressure required to form it. And they've used this material, Suvite, to build the church, but unfortunately it's probably not the best material as it erodes quite readily, and they've had to start replacing the bricks in this church. But an interesting fact about Suvite is that it actually is comprised of millions and millions of micro diamonds. Unfortunately, they're less than 0.2 millimeters across, so you can't find any of them. But it did create 72,000 tons when it hit a local graphite deposit. But from the top of the church, you can look at birds, or should I say, you can look at dinosaurs. We've got a nice kestrel, and you can look down into the nests of the storks. And when you're having your dinner in the evening in the town square, you can look up at the stork nests as they look down on you. So, did I find my own fossil bird? If I had, I wouldn't have been able to bring it home. I would have had to have declared it to the state because it's that rare. Same for pterodactyls. But as Charles Darwin quotes in The Origin of Species, the noble science of geology loses glory from the extreme perfection of the fossil record. The crust of the earth with its embedded remains must not be looked at as a well-filled museum, but a poor collection made at hazard and at rare intervals. So no, I didn't. It's incredibly rare. There's only 12 specimens, maybe 13, maybe 11, depending on who you believe at the moment. But there's only been around 12 since 1860, One of those is just a feather. Another is just a wing bone, the chicken wing bone. But I did find my own vertebrate, a small fish. You see the skull up there. And that's the end. Thank you, if you're still there.
Thank you, Gary. I think you've held the audience throughout. It's been a constant group of people, so it's been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. We asked if anyone would actually list questions in the chat, but I'm not sure we've got many people doing so. Are there any questions from the floor from people? If people can unmute if they wish to raise a question. Or if people can put their screens on and perhaps put their hand up so I know who's looking at. Okay, so we got Jean.
Can I, you know, having a museum and something we're so conscious of as preserving these things, you know, they're exposed in the quarries, but probably a lot of specimens were lost in the quarrying, were they?
Quite possibly, yeah. But I think a lot of the quarry workers were very astute as well. They knew the importance of them, and they knew they could make, especially back in the Victorian time, well, even today actually, they knew that if they found something good, they could probably sell it and make a bit of money on the side. So they are, yeah, you're right. But at the same time, in those days, a lot of the work was done manually. So they would have split those rocks and seen that something was there and soon learnt the importance of it. You know, it's actually the quarryman that found the fossil bird, the Archaeopteryx. It wasn't paleontologists, it was quarrymen that found the early ones. Yeah. But they knew that they could sell it to the local doctor because they knew he was a collector, or they could use it to pay for their medical fees.
Yeah. Thank you.
We've got Sue Carter.
She doesn't want to answer.
Sue there? Sue put a question. Thank you. Do you think we may be destroying these fossils by automating quarrying, etc.? Sorry,
certainly in the first quarry, the one that was actually strip mining, that could happen because they're using diggers now in that particular quarry. In the Shale quarry that I went to the first time, they're using JCB, so yeah, stuff would be easily destroyed and lost.
Okay.
But then look at what they've got in the museum that they've already found anyway. You know, it's the same if you go to Lyme Regis when there's a big storm, that could take down some of the cliff, and same thing could happen. You know, a lot of things have actually been found because of the quarrying, or because the sea has come down and washed away it's exposed part of a skeleton, and then people have been able to go in and excavate and salvage the rest of it. But as Charles Darwin said, what you see as a fossil is a very small collection of what actually lived on Earth at that time. The fossil record is very poor. And there's always, the thing I always find when I go to places like that, and my biggest disappointment from that trip was only having 2 hours in a quarry. And there's always like, oh, I just want to split one more rock. You know, there could be one, what could be in that next one? That's the thrill of looking for things like that. You never know what the next.
Surprised we got you back, Gary.
Well, I had to get on the coach. So. I'd love to get back there, and now I know where the quarries are and which ones you can get into. How can I put it? Officially and unofficially.
Right. So, any other questions? Sorry, Stephen.
Gary, thank you very much. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. Have you done much fossil hunting down on the Jurassic Coast? So I know in the past we went to the Isle of Wight with the kids, and it was fantastic seeing the footprints on the beach there, and some cool fossil shops. But and I remember finding a rock. It was about this big, and it looked like a leg bone about this big, but it was too big to carry off the beach. But have you found much stuff when you've been down in that neck of the woods in the past?
I haven't been down that way for a long time, to be honest, but I do actually remember going to Lyme Regis and finding an ammonite that was 2 foot across, and I just had to leave it there. It was too big, you know. Yeah. I've been to the Isle of Wight a few times, and not as often as I'd like. That's a good place, but to be honest, most of the best finds I had are actually found in old quarries around Cheltenham, where I was living at the time, and quite often they are actually brick pits or landfill sites. I should have mentioned actually those small ammonites I showed in the first museum. For my undergraduate project, I did a study on ammonites from a landfill site just south of Oxford that now doesn't exist. If you go there today, it's completely landscaped, it's ponds, it's lakes, it's reservoirs, it's boating lakes. I went there when it was a landfill site, so you had to sort of, well, if the wind was blowing the wrong way, it didn't smell very nice, but in 4 days I collected over 1,000 ammonites. Most of them no bigger than a 5p piece, admittedly, they're all pyritized, and I've still got 1,000 ammonites actually today. So yeah, I'm not been to Lyme Regis that much, but there is stuff being found there all the time.
Okay.
And also,
Gary, how good is the North Wales coast? Because I had the honour once of going to, it was an honorary doctorate that was given to David Attenborough by university, and I remember him saying that in his childhood he used to actually go fossiling around the Penmon area. Is it fairly good across North Wales?
well, Richard Birch is probably a better person to answer that question. Actually, he knows more about Anglesey. There are Carboniferous fossils I know from Anglesey that you can see corals, and in fact, Steve actually posted some pictures from Holyhead breakwater, which has actually got Carboniferous corals in it, and they actually came from around Red Wolf Bay. So yeah, you can find fossils from Anglesey. I mean, don't know too much about them, to be honest.
I've noticed around Chemice in a lot of the dry stone walls, there's lots of fossilized shells. That's quite interesting to see.
Yeah, it's probably the Carboniferous limestone, like on the Great Orme, you can find lots of brachiopods, Gigantoproductus and stuff, and corals and whatnot.
Isn't it true that the opening scene from the original classic series of David Attenborough, Life on Earth, the first scene is on top in the Nantfranken Valley?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I've got the David Attenborough books. Actually, I was just going to have a quick look and see if there was a photo. But, quite possibly, I don't know. I know Charles Darwin actually went to Comidwell and came to North Wales quite a lot, and they actually commemorate that now actually at Comidwell. Yeah, I haven't watched Life on Earth for a long time. I don't know, to be honest.
It's just Richard told me about it, but I've just been too lazy to actually get up to that spot. But it's on my list of things to do.
Yeah, I mean, I know people have found. Well, I know somebody who found a trilobite at the top of Comidwell.
All right. Yeah. And
if you go to the top of Alidavar, you can actually see the trace fossils of trilobites, the actual paths they make. Well, they have been seen. But
does anybody want to see one?
Yeah, see, Richard will answer this question better than me because he knows North Wales far better than me.
Give me 5. I'll go and get a massive fossil. Hang on.
Because what I didn't do was actually get my fossils from the other room so that I could hold them up in front of you, because actually they might be in my lockup, actually locked away actually. But yeah, sorry, I didn't do that.
Nigel, you trying to...
This is that book, by the way. Anybody? Oh, it's not working, is it? No, I can't see it with my picture. There you go. My friend wrote this. That's all about the history of finding Archaeopteryx.
Yeah, that looks really intriguing.
If you're into Victorian, and he's got all the details of how much paid and the arguments and the skullduggery and the going behind the scenes, and he actually wrote, well, I don't know how he did it. He did a PhD in diatoms and he wrote a book at the same time, and he's written about 7 or 8 books now. There we go. Here comes Richard with his.
Oh, you're a show off, Richard. That's amazing.
This is as good as it gets in North Wales, I'm afraid. So these right. And God knows what else that actually lived there. I don't know if you're going to see that, but
crikey,
that's what you get in Cumgraniog, and it's famous for that. But that's as good as it gets in North Wales, I'm afraid. We don't get any dinosaurs or birds or anything like that. It's the small stuff.
No, still impressive.
Nigel, can I call on you, Nigel, perhaps to give a vote of thanks?
Yeah, it's my pleasure. A moment ago, Gary, you said that Darwin said that the fossil record was a very poor representation of past life on Earth. But that certainly couldn't be said of your presentation tonight. It was certainly not poor, and it was a fantastic representation of things we've missed because we've arrived ourselves a bit too late to see them. Thank you very much. I mean, that was a memorable talk, partly because it was so different, and partly because you're so expert and you put so much time and trouble into presenting it so well. I've never seen such a lovely gallery of such a variety of fossils. And if there's ever a Collins Guide to Jurassic wildlife produced, then I think they should ask you, first of all, to illustrate it, because that's what it was like, really. It was so enjoyable just leafing through past wildlife with you like that and having it all explained, their life history, their evolution. It really took us back in time and, you know, opened our eyes, not just to the birds, of course, but everything that lives with birds in their natural environments, indeed everything that has co-evolved with them. So it really painted a rich picture. And I love the way you did it by describing your own personal expedition. That makes it so much more exciting and brings those places that you mentioned to life. And certainly the two main areas on both sides of the sixth mass extinction were so revealing, and it was remarkable to see the level of preservation, both of the Jurassic and then even more so of those Eocene fossils that just look like present day hoopoes and what have you. So thank you. That was a real treat and a real eye-opener. What was also interesting, I thought, was the way in which, obviously in Germany, they buy into their natural resources in a way which I think in Britain we just don't do. And they do it so well and make such a feature of it. And so good for them. I think there's a lot of pointers there for what we could do far better in the UK. I like the way you also included some of the controversies surrounding some of the classic fossils, adding a bit of mystery and intrigue to the whole thing. Geology is certainly a fascinating subject, and I admire geologists for the way they delve into detail, the way in which they can interpret past species and the environments in which they lived and died and explain it to us. Often, though, that's highly technical. And the other thing that was so good tonight was that you described it in very easygoing way, and it was just so easy for us and such a treat to absorb. So thank you very much indeed for taking us back in time. We're all interested in birds today, but this evening I think we're a hell of a lot more interested than we were in birds of the past, and linking the two is a fabulous story, and I'm sure tonight's talk will long live in the memory of those of us lucky enough to be here. But also it's nice to know that it's now on record and other people can enjoy it after 2 weeks online. So good for you, good for the bird group, and particularly Henry and Martin for hosting the talk so far and for providing this super facility. Thank you on behalf of us all, Gary. It was a splendid talk. Cheerio.
I just got one thing, sorry, to say. I forgot to say about the Jura Museum, actually, going on what you've just said, if you go there, they don't just have the fossils, they actually have the meaning. So they actually have an aquarium with live organisms in the aquarium, and then fossil ones directly above it.
Yeah.
And in the bird, they actually have stuffed birds next to fossil birds. And they actually put an emphasis actually on the linking of what present and the past.
Yeah.
Which is something I forgot to mention, and something that's to build on what Steve said and what you just said. There is actually a museum down in Kimmeridge Bay now called the Steve Etches Collection. It's actually very similar to actually some of the museums in Germany. They've really bought into it there. And Steve Etches is actually a plumber who collects fossils as a hobby and had them in his house and prepared them all. And they managed to get the funds to build him his own museum. So he
Great.
can take stuff out of his house. I've not been there myself. It's somewhere I want to go, and it's supposed to be, well, it's an immaculate collection there as well. And they've actually got a glass fronted area where you can actually go and watch the curators and preparers actually preparing the fossils in like a viewing gallery.
Even
So
better.
there is a start of that in the UK, but certainly not in the same way, not to the scale of Germany.
Oh, well, thank you for highlighting that. Hopefully we'll catch up with the Germans.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone that's taken part tonight, in both in terms of the presentation and all the contributions and the thanks that have been given. The next session, next Wednesday, Sean Russell will be speaking about the ever earlier arrival of spring. And so that's our next talk. So until then, I wish you the very, very best. Take care.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you.